Most of them are in the 50s, of course. When it comes to official impunity, that has always remained low, less than, just around about a third of Africans feeling that officials who commit crimes actually can be punished. But by and large, it's not the case on the continent. It's been relatively low. But as you can see for the other institutions, whether or not people think there's low corruption, whether the president never ignores the courts, all of these evaluations have been quite low over time, and of course declining in some cases. All right, so I'm turning on just to look at people's assessment of the extent of democracy in their countries. And you can see over time, this has been the picture that we have, whether people are satisfied with democracy and the extent to which they evaluate their country's state of democracy. And we do have now at this point, especially this time around, the survey round that took place in 2021, 2022, we'll have a minority feeling that their country is a democracy and also expressing satisfaction with the way democracy works in their countries. And the final things I want to mention here is performance gaps. Of course, the delivery of democratic goods has been a critical driver of what African citizens are experiencing in terms of feeling that their leaders are not living up to expectation. But then, of course, the economy is another consideration. And there are some gaps there as well. When we asked African citizens across the continent, including most countries in West Africa, whether or not they feel their governments are doing well in managing the economy or creating jobs or narrowing income gaps, these have been relative very low over time. And of course, over time, as you can see on the picture here, they have been declining. And especially when it comes to issues like control of inflation or keeping prices stable, narrowing income gaps, all of these have been dropping over time. So even though we don't necessarily want to link economic conditions directly to democratic attitudes, you can imagine that people's feeling about the economy do have implications for how a democratic governance system can survive. And of course, some of the co-leaders have actually cited some of these issues as the reasons why they have intervened in some of the governance issues. And so even though the democratic goods are critically important, the economy is certainly not, cannot be ignored in this particular case. In terms of living conditions, we have also been quite concerned. The Africa Rising narrative that used to be discussed in the 2014, 2015, all the way through maybe the 2019, we did realize that there was some kind of effect, because you can see that in 2014, 2015, the number of people or proportion of Africans who reported that they have gone without food was quite relatively low compared to today. If you look at the numbers today, they've gone really very high. And so we've seen this actually grown over time, that people who have told us they've gone without food many times or several times has grown over time. But more importantly, Afrobarometer has something we call the Lived Poverty Index. And what we have observed over time is that, in 2014, 2015, we had just 48%, about half of Africans experiencing lived high, moderate or high lived poverty. But over time, this has increased, and the most recent survey was actually alarming, that 60% of Africans now telling us they have experienced moderate or high lived poverty. And I also wanted to highlight this partly because the economy does play a huge role in how people feel about democratic governance or the delivery of governance on the continent. All right, so what is the major threat here? First of all, military. We have all talked about military, especially in the West Africa region. This has been a big concern. The good news is that if you look across the continent on average, of course, the rejection of military rule is still very high, 66% on average across the continent. The West Africa figure is almost around that, is a little lower, but on average is still a majority view. The only concern for us here and for the West Africa region is Burkina Faso and Mali, where we do see that it's only a minority of citizens in Burkina Faso and Mali who say they reject military rule. But this is not the alarming, concern or threat. The alarming threat is over time, we do see that the change in people's resistance to military rule, the extent to which Africans resisted military rule in 2014 has weakened significantly in the majority of countries. And the large drops have occurred in the West Africa region. So in Guinea, Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Burkina Faso, and Mali, people's resistance to military rule is much lower. And I think this is also something that Wademos needs to consider, because as we work on this agenda and in the region, in the West Africa region, still do reject military rule, the extent to which they did so has dropped a bit over time. We need to be mindful of that. Right. And then the last point I want to raise here is the fact that when we asked the last time whether if their elected leaders abuse power, we do have a slim majority of Africans actually saying that yes, the military should intervene if their elected leaders abuse power. And then the concern here is actually for the young people, because we can see that young people on the continent, actually a majority, they are much more likely to tell us that the military should intervene if their elected leaders abuse power. All right, but there's some good news, of course, and the good news have been highlighted already, that support for democracy on the continent is still very high. Rejection of authoritarian forms of government are still very high as well. And so this is something that Wademos can take comfort in the fact that support for democracy, rejection of non-democratic alternatives is still very high on the continent. And we can continue to ride on that wave. When you look at it, even over time, we still have solid majorities reporting that they prefer democracy to any other form of government and would reject all non-democratic alternatives. Similarly, when it comes to the other institutions of governance, support for these institutions are pretty strong. Of course, one concern we had was support for media freedom. It did drop quite significantly in 2016, but has since risen to the same level as the rest of the institutions. And so in all, what I want to say is, even though there are these concerns of threats and then the risks and the backsliding of democracy in the West Africa region, we should take comfort in the fact that citizens in the region are still supportive of democracy, still supportive of the democratic institutions. And there's room for Wademos and partners to build on this momentum and continue to advance our democratic governance in the region. So I'll thank you and I'll yield to you, Mr. Moderator.
Manière beaucoup plus nourrie, le docteur et Joseph. Je crois que son intervention est partie de la confiance des populations vis-à-vis des institutions. Et sur ces différents aspects, on a noté dans son intervention qu'il y avait une forte diminution de la confiance et des populations aux institutions, que ce soit le Parlement, que ce soit la justice. Il y avait quand même une nette diminution. Mais par contre, il y avait des populations qui ont une relative confiance dans les militaires et dans l'armée. On note également que d'un point de vue de la corruption, il y a un niveau vraiment élevé et de la population qui manque de confiance dans les dirigeants. On remarque également que les populations ont de plus en plus peur des représailles et qu'on peut remarquer dans les tentatives de dénonciation de la corruption. Il y a un problème avec la traduction, toujours. C'est bon? OK. Et le docteur Joseph a essayé de peindre le tableau en nous faisant remarquer qu'il y avait quand même une forte absence de reddition de comptes, ce qui naturellement alimente ce genre de déficit et qu'on remarque dans la sous-région en matière de démocratie. Et l'intervention du docteur a chuté sur le fait que le nombre de populations qui estiment vivre dans la pauvreté aujourd'hui a nettement augmenté. Vous comprenez logiquement la relation entre développement, démocratie et bonne gouvernance. Donc, nous remercions une fois de plus le docteur Joseph Assonka pour cette intervention qui plante un peu le décor et qui peint le tableau de la situation et au niveau de l'Afrique, mais surtout au niveau de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et il est temps maintenant de donner la parole au docteur Emmanuel Akwete, qui est le directeur exécutif de l'Institut pour la gouvernance démocratique. Et docteur, vous avez la parole pour 10 minutes. Merci.
Thank you very much. My French is better than English, but because most of us are English speaking, I thought I should do it in English so that my brother, the director of what they must, will get it right. But that's a light note. I think threats to democracy in West Africa has become a popular topic. I decided to just look for materials that would enlighten me on this, and I found so many. I found Brookings' Threats to Democracy in Africa, but when you read it, the rise of the constitutional coup, so West Africa features predominantly. Then I also found one that says Trends that Define Democracy in Africa, which is 2022, almost the same factors. And then DIVEX comes in with 5 ways to tackle threats to democracy in Africa. As far as I'm concerned, we've had the evidence that, yes, there is widespread dissatisfaction across the sub-region and probably beyond. And it did a very interesting thing by giving the 5 things that if we did, will fix this threat. One, it says, implement legal instruments and standards. When I read through, I saw that, well, they are talking about, we have a lot of legal instruments. We have our constitution, we have policies. So I wanted to know, what exactly is the legal instrument and standards? And also, whether those disillusioned, predominantly the youth, really look at the legal instruments and the standards, or they are talking empirically about the lack of the dividends that they expected. They vote for representatives and they have clear message of what they need and which they think should be addressed. We also told that the second one is that we should condemn and reject unconstitutional changes of government, which we do, but I thought that the ECOWAS deterrence factor, where it said we would not tolerate, alteration of constitutional provisions on terms, term limits, and that if you're going there, ECOWAS would take action. And ultimately, it could mobilize soldiers or armed forces to come across from member countries, like we saw in Gambia, 2016. Unfortunately, if we look at what has happened with Chad, where ECOWAS couldn't mobilize, which also gave space to civil society to also come with other alternatives or ideas. This is something that needs to be looked at, scrutinized, whether we can just reject unconstitutional changes. In West Africa, as a spread, without the ECOWAS factor being put back in a way. So now we have 5 countries. If what happened in Sierra Leone, and we all woke up to what was happening, had actually resorted to a coup or whatever, what would ECOWAS do? It seems to me that West Africa, in particular, history of authoritarianism, military rule and something, would say that to get democracy as a standard across would require an ECOWAS or a sub-regional body that deters. It's not that deterrence wouldn't come from domestic level, but you must be assured of a force that says no. Just like post-Second World War, and not just the US station in Germany is still there. And in many places, Japan. And we also know South, in South Asia. So deterrence requires that there's a supra body, national or international, and we had one, but I think we must take seriously the weakness of the ECOWAS deterrence factor. It's probably what is fueling. Nobody is afraid now. And I think when you look at it, what is probably profoundly disturbing is how that space, the deterrence that we no longer are afraid of, is being filled by Wagner. We've had countries, all the countries involved, with the exception of Guinea. I think Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and then you look at Niger. They just push aside ECOWAS in spite of everything and went to, Wagner from Russia. There was this embarrassment where in the summit, as we're dealing with these problems of coup and how we handle it, they went to a summit in Russia, in Moscow, and they were asking for all sorts of support. At the same time, you also saw the situation where the president of Ghana in the Democracy Summit in the US also coming up to speak about the threat that the Wagner forces posed to democracy in West Africa. So some external defense or external factor defending democracy in a sub-region where we see ourselves as one and connected and so on. It's an important conversation we should have. If what had existed hasn't worked, what do we do to make it work? That's the first point I would make. The second point is that we've done 30 years, at least we've seen 30 years of democratic stability. And ECOWAS, to my mind, played a role. But so did UN and AU. But if you look at it carefully, we have no such guarantees for the next 30 years.
I'm hopeful that to resolve.
And the next 30 years, those who would lead, those who would join parties, those who will be presidents and so on, are the youth. And as you listen to Afrobarometer, it's clear that we have not, our democracy in the first 30 years has not delivered the dividends that people want. They still like their civil and political liberties, that they can speak without fear, that they can be online, that they can use all the tools technology gives to communicate. But that is a factor we should consider. It could mobilize, they can mobilize without police forces instantly coming to chase them out and all that. We saw what happened in Egypt before the spring, the first, and how tools could help people mobilize and protest. As we look at it carefully, what we've realized is that the youth, men, women, educated, mostly also graduates to some extent, a huge majority of graduates, well-connected, no longer have options to say, look, if our rights will not be respected, we can't find jobs, we don't have the opportunities after university We can go abroad. So crossover, go to Europe, America, and so on. Those options are closed. And some of them now are split between calling for military coups, fix the country. Others are also still searching. They feel they are in a position that they must be able to turn the situation around. But what conditions prevail for them to be able to build themselves in the, as pressure groups or joint parties that will bring this about? Those processes are ongoing. I don't think we should dismiss them easily. That there is no one path to securing democracy in the next generational span, in the next 30 years. I think this alternation between military, authoritarian military rule or coup d'etat engineered internally by civilians or not cannot be the option. I believe strongly that because in the last 30 years, civil and political liberties have been strengthened and there are tools for defending them and so on, unless we find a formula to this sustaining democracy, and for that matter, democracy delivering the dividends that relatively more educated youth than our generation were, in those in the 60s and 70s and so on, compared to those in 2003 and 2023 and over. It's not going to be the same. They are not going to trade off their freedom. And they can't have the option of going out as they used to do. So we are faced with a risk. Will they fight? Or what methods will they use to bring about peaceful change or change the government? And when it goes there, I feel that fundamentally we are overlooking the fact that we must critique the constitutional frameworks that exist or that were introduced in the 90s as we moved into the third wave and see whether they are effective, and if they are not effective, what reforms are needed and can they be executed? The same way we have to ask ourselves, the political parties that emerged in the 90s, third wave of democracy, were they equipped and inspired by coming to build a new country or West African country that will satisfy the needs of its citizens, especially those educated and sophisticatedly exposed to trends elsewhere, and therefore get them to input into processes, whether the decisions they are making, or make them the focal point of the policies they put on the table. We should not forget that the youth are the majority voters, and they are very strongly attached to democratic values, and the process is open to them. But can they operate within the existing framework, the constitution that led us to the current republics we have? In Ghana, we talk about the Fourth Republic. Others would number it differently. And I think this is where the problem is. If we take the youth, they found out that the parties do not respond to them, to their demands, although they vote. And they are also not necessarily members. The majority are not in parties, but they still want solutions to their problems. So we have to ask the question, what is it that can be done for political parties? Maybe we reform them, or they respond to the needs of the population, those who give them the votes, the majority of which are the youth. We cannot just want democracy without thinking of the nature of political parties, which many of whom are operating like authoritarian regimes. And I think that we need to confront this issue, that the new generation is not accepting that kind of order. Neither do they have the solution or preferring alternatives. Maybe some of us here could get into that situation and contribute. So we may be talking about threats, but I think our focus should be, if our analysis is right, is to think solutions to the institutions, the mechanisms in place and so on, and how they can be more actively activated to respond to the needs of the youth who in the next 30 years are going to take over leadership and so on. Are we doing that? Maybe the third and last point, since I have only 10 minutes. At the end of the day, it seems to me that the alternation of democracy and authoritarianism is one of the things we need to confront. Most of the things we're doing now, if you look at the constitutions of the day, there is, you feel it, quite a palpable amount of authoritarianism in it. They are not building inclusive societies or nations. Indeed, inclusive democracy, if you go to Ghana or you're looking at Ghana, almost all the majority citizens who vote talk about exclusion. And I think exclusion comes from authoritarianism. And we've preserved it in a way. People do not have representation. Women do not have representation. Youth, they are complaining. How do we re-engineer these systems? So it's not a matter of us talking about, oh, our democracy is reversal and so on. The reversal would happen if we do not find solutions to and articulate or frame the issues worrying the youth. And I think that is the challenge we're ignoring. And we are listening too much to many of the external, oh, this is what we should do, AU was coming, or ECOWAS. No, when it comes to people feeling they are listened to, they influence policy, they see change happening in wherever they live and so on. And we do not address these mechanisms, we are not going to go forward. So constitutions that led us into these new situations now need to be critically reviewed and the necessary amendments effected. It's been very difficult to effect constitutional changes or put a framework in place that will say political parties didn't work in the 50s. For us, we went one party, but in the current dispensation, we've made reforms that says political parties, which in terms of a representative democracy, you can abolish them and you can't always keep them out and say, look, it's only state institutions that could govern. We see they can disguise themselves, and at worst, the youth will resort to violence. So going forward, for me, yes, there are threats to democracy, but those threats must also be reflected upon within the context of the framework of governance and development, and whether it is moving a highly educated youth. Most of the youth we have in Africa today are, relatively speaking, highly educated. And we should ask if the institutional framework responds, the constitution responds to their needs and their aspirations. So I would emphasize the need to look at those constitutions, how inclusive democracy is being promoted by them, are they adequate or not? Can we change them? But let's also change our attitudes and take greater interest in reforming political parties to be true democratic institutions and development agents. We are so quick to dismiss them. But what do we have? So far, the history shows that the alternation is between the military and the political party. But can we change that? So I would end it here. Thank you.
Merci. Merci au docteur Emmanuel Akwete. Et à vous suivre, on a quand même l'impression que vous plaidez pour une réinvention de l'idéal démocratique et en Afrique, notamment en Afrique de l'Ouest. Vous prônez beaucoup plus la recherche de solutions véritables aux causes profondes du déclin démocratique en Afrique. Vous dressez également le constat d'une démocratie qui fait des vagues, c'est-à-dire qui vibre au rythme d'une alternance entre démocratie et régime plus ou moins de dictature, ou peut-être de dictature éclairée dans la sous-région ouest-africaine. Je crois que vous insistez sur le fait d'inclure les jeunes dans les politiques au niveau de nos pays. Et il est important, selon vous, de prendre en compte les aspirations profondes des populations, sans quoi la démocratie va toujours vaciller au rythme peut-être des coups d'État, et que ce soit des coups d'État militaires ou peut-être des failles que nous remarquons souvent dans la tentative de chefs d'État qui s'accrochent plus ou moins au pouvoir. Merci une fois de plus pour la qualité de votre intervention. Et quand nous parlons de démocratie, nous parlons également de renforcement de capacités. Je crois que c'est un élément important qui joue la culture démocratique. La question revenait tantôt, est-ce que les jeunes ou la jeunesse africaine est suffisamment cultivée aujourd'hui? Est-ce qu'il y a un ancrage de culture démocratique aujourd'hui dans nos pays? Est-ce que finalement, ce n'est pas parce que nos pays ne sont pas encore solidement ancrés dans la culture démocratique qu'on connaît toujours des problèmes? Peut-être faudra-t-il également réinventer la notion d'intérêt général dans nos pays. Je vais donc passer la parole à Madame Nana Asantewa Afadinou. Vous êtes la directrice exécutive de WAXI. Vous cumulez à votre compte plus de 23 ans d'expérience et d'engagement au sein de la société civile. Vous avez certainement beaucoup à nous dire sur cette question de recul ou de menace à la démocratie dans nos pays. Et je vais donc vous laisser la parole et demander à ce que l'auditoire puisse vous introduire par des ovations nourries.
Merci beaucoup, mon frère. So I would like for us to look at this from our own perspective as civil society. For me, I think that is one of the major threats that we have. Civil society in West Africa. Over the years, I think one of the major challenges has been that civil society has grown weaker in West Africa. And that is one of the threats to our democracy. What do I mean? One is, I think I would give a number of reasons. One of them is, I think that over the years, there seems to have grown what I would call a disconnect between the average, ordinary citizen and civil society organizations, particularly NGOs. And this is at different levels. Ideological positioning is one. And even the national, you have the divisions between national level organizations, CBOs, and there's a disconnect. And so when it comes to addressing challenges in our different countries, you find that we are not necessarily speaking with one voice. And some of us are seen to be elites, civil society organizations. Others see themselves as we are the ones doing the work. We are the ones connected to the community. But we are all addressing issues affecting all of us. So how do we address that disconnection that has happened over the years? And I think that is one of the things that we need to be looking at. What I will call weak solidarity, and that's why I'm so happy. I'm one of the major champions of Wademos. Because I think a number of things, unhealthy competition is one of the things that has plagued civil society in West Africa. Unhealthy competition, we see ourselves, we work in silos. And so all of us are kind of protecting our territories. We care more for our logos, you know, and you know, us, our egos. It's us, I'm the one doing this or doing that. And it's all linked to resourcing a lot of the time, because we are all gunning for the funding to be able to do the work. And to do that, you need to be visible. And if your organization is the one that is seen the most, you are the one who is funded the most. So that is one of the challenges. I know that some of the things I'm saying are not necessarily palatable, but we have to face them. If we are going to deal with, fixing the challenges that we have to fix ourselves as civil society. I think partisan politics in some of our countries, civil society has become aligned with certain political parties. Of course, some of the narratives are not true, because when you position yourself on a particular principle, there may be a political party that decides to support that principle. But then when that political party comes into power and they are fighting that principle, you should be seen to go against them. So the principled stance of organizations and distinguishing that with being partisan is one of the challenges that we have. And then non-sustained engagement, driven mainly by our funding. Because you are funded, to do a particular project. After a while, the funding doesn't come, and it's challenging to sustain the work that has begun. So the work around projectized funding and how we deal with that, and engage is one of the challenges. And then again, connected to resourcing, weak and weakened or weakening institutions. And when I say that, I'm talking about very little or no investment going into building institutions. And so we are getting support and funding for programs and programming and projects, and very little is going into building strong institutions. Our governance, our management, our operations, our people. And so you find that we are the ones, we lose people so easily. You work with people for a number of years, you train them, and then you lose them. Because we don't have that resourcing to support. And then, of course, what I will call also connected to this is a number of organizations, and when COVID hit, this really came out very strongly. We don't have any cushion at all, no reserves for many of our organizations. We don't have reserves at all. And so, and this is again connected to the kind of funding that we have. Because a lot of the funding that is coming does not allow you to build reserves. So that if anything happens and you don't have money that is coming in regularly, you have something that can sustain the continued operation of the organization. So for me, these are some of the things that we have to look at. And that, again, is it puts us, we have constraints in programming. So because we have restricted funding for a lot of the money that is coming in, you don't have the flexibility to respond as an organization, to be agile and respond when issues are coming up. Because you have a project for a particular thing, and your donor will not allow you to use the funding to address certain issues that are coming up. But you are in the country, you are seeing that this is coming up, we have to address it as a civil society organization, but you don't have the flexibility to do so because of the kind of funding that you have. There is an assault on civic space, and I think all of us know that. Legal, policy, regulatory, institutional assault on civic space, and technology and new media is being used as well. Misinformation, disinformation, those, I see Media Foundation in the house. These are some of the things that we are facing as civil society. It's all related to the continued and continuous weakening. Then I also see what I call a false dichotomy between social movements and traditional civil society. I call it false because very often social movements include many of these traditional organizations. And so what we have to be looking at is particularly looking at how we address this issue And for me, the challenge that we have is that we have social movements that deal with an issue. As long as they maybe meet a certain threshold, the matter is dropped and we don't sustain the gains that have been made. And then we revert. And we can give several examples. And in Nigeria, NSAS is one of the challenges that we have. Ghana is facing its own with Fix the Country. We have Ballet Citoyen, Yenama in Senegal. There are several social movements that have pushed for democratic engagement. And a lot of the time, we kind of fizzle out. Because long-term planning, yes, social movements are organic. They are supposed to, deal with issues. But how do we sustain the engagement and the gains? And so that's one of the areas. Again, that brings about some weakness. And then for us in West Africa, what I call the phone issue, Anglophone, Francophone, Lusophone. And we allow this to divide us. We allow this to divide. And I'm saying allow because honestly, in West Africa, we have more languages connecting us than those phones that the colonial masters brought. Yoruba, Ewe, Hausa, Akan, Tree. We have so many, Fula, Pula, so many languages cutting across Wolof. I looked at Sheikh and remembered Wolof. There are so many languages that are cutting across. There's so much that connects us than divides us. But a lot of it, even in our own meetings, civil society, Francophone group, Anglophone group, and we divide ourselves with this. And I think that is one of the things that we have to address. If we want to push for democracy in solidarity, we have to put aside all these fools. Language is something, as I'm speaking, all of us can understand. It really doesn't matter. What is important is comprehension and understanding and communication. And that is what we have to focus on than the Francophone. And it totally doesn't matter. So that's one of the things that I think are a threat to us. Then the second major threat, that's on the weakened or weakening civil society. The second major threat is geopolitical developments. And Dr. Akwete touched on some of those things. The rise of the right wing in Europe, including like the change very recently in Netherlands of one of the most right-wing politicians that they have. In the Trump phenomenon in the US, the popularity of leaders like Kagame in Rwanda, the strongman image in international politics, Turkey, Philippines, India, until recently, Brazil. And the alternative that we have now for many of our governments to the US and the UK, Russia and China. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because the perception that we have these alternatives who do not necessarily support the things that we are talking about, liberal democracy, social justice, they are not interested in it. And so previously, where we would be having a certain kind of support as civil society, to push certain agendas, that support has diminished significantly. And our governments in West Africa no longer see the need to be politically correct because they have this other side that's where they can go for funding, where they can go, they can get support. And Dr. Akwete mentioned, for example, the issue of Wagner in a number of these countries where there have been coups d'etat. So it is a real threat to us. And I think I don't know if we'll have time to talk about solutions. I was hoping we would have time to talk about, because really that's what we should be talking about, the solutions. But that is where we have to not only build solidarity amongst ourselves, but international solidarity with other civil society groupings outside West Africa who are also pushing the same narrative that we are pushing. I think the third huge threat that I see is a seeming irrelevance or weakness of multilateral institutions. And with that, related to that, the normative frameworks that they work, they have championed. And I'm talking specifically about the UN, I'm talking about the AU, I'm talking about ECOWAS. And the UN, I think the example, you can look at what's happening in Gaza recently and see how the UN just seems weak, unable to respond. And everybody is seeing it. And so our citizens, when we are talking about, we are pushing, no, this is a human rights instrument of the UN, and this is, our countries have signed this and ratified it, and it sounds lame because the UN does not seem like a strong institution where they are concerned. They are not responding to the issues. And we know those challenges, they are institutional challenges. That's why we have that. AU, the case, the Libya example is one of, with Gaddafi and what happened, was one of the things that made the AU look very, very weak. And people were asking, where was the AU for us in Africa? Yes, Gaddafi may have had his problems, but how come the NATO can go into Libya and clear an African leader like that without the AU standing up? So those are some of the questions. And for us as civil society, because we align, we believe in the principles that have set up these institutions, and we support them, and we expect their normative frameworks and the things that come out of those institutions to support our work and push for democracy. So on which legs are we standing when these are so weak? So that's the other thing. ECOWAS, we've talked about it, the current coups, and a lot of it coming because of challenges with the term limits and the seeming inability of the heads of states to address this problem. And it has been there because there have been civil society organizations that have championed this. And over the years, it looks like ECOWAS is crippled. And so there's a seeming or perceived loss of moral authority where ECOWAS is concerned. ECOWAS may have legal authority to be able to intervene, engage, countries in different ways, but moral authority. And that is why we are getting the pushback, not only from the coup makers, but actually from citizens. And that is very worrying. And the other thing I think that we need to look at as civil society is, if you look at ECOWAS, it's not only that other aspect. Other institutions of ECOWAS, like the court, the ECOWAS Community Court, makes its ruling, and it cannot be enforced in our countries because the institutions that must be set up in our individual national countries to enable the ECOWAS court's judgments to be enforced in our countries have not been done, and nothing has been done. There's nothing. And so ECOWAS court makes a ruling and nothing happens. And there's a number of cases like that. And the ECOWAS parliament is another. How do we even know I mean, what is this? What kind of check and balance does the ECOWAS Parliament have on the ECOWAS heads of state? You know, and how do we even engage as civil society? So, I mean, for me, these are the three, I would say, huge threats that I see. Weakened civil society, the challenges that we have geopolitically, and then our multilateral institutions. I think all the other things have been mentioned already. And for civil society, we must see these areas as very critical as we go forward, as some of the threats that we have to address. And I like the keynote. I was telling Marcella that she took the wind out of my sails in some of the things that she said, because honestly, we have to introspect and fix our own house. I will stop here. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Nana et Afadinou, que je demande d'ovationner une fois de plus. Vous pointez du doigt un certain nombre de problèmes qui, naturellement, sont inhérents à la société civile elle-même et en Afrique de l'Ouest. Parce que, naturellement, on remarque une société civile qui évolue en rang dispersé. Et il y a quand même aussi que la société civile s'ouvre et en interne des fenêtres de tir, ce qui fragilise naturellement ses actions et le positionnement idéologique même au sein de la société civile reste aussi un problème qui n'aide pas la synergie d'action et à suivre un peu votre développement. Vous pointez également du doigt la faiblesse des institutions. Vous avez parlé notamment de la faiblesse des institutions de la CEDEAO qui peinent véritablement à s'imposer dans la sous-région comme étant de véritables organisations sous-régionales qui doivent imprimer la démarche à suivre et aux États en matière de gouvernance démocratique en Afrique de l'Ouest. Et puis, vous chutez en réalité votre intervention sur la nécessité d'une réorganisation, je crois, en interne au niveau des organisations de la société civile qui doivent jouer leur rôle entre griffes de contre-pouvoir et au sein des États, et sans quoi nous irons toujours de problème en problème ou de difficulté en difficulté. C'est d'ailleurs ce en quoi nous pouvons peut-être saluer cette action de Wademos qui essaye de remettre aujourd'hui la société civile en synergie sur les rails pour que des voix au niveau des différents pays puissent s'entendre et clamer la nécessité pour nos pays de revenir aux idéaux, aux fondamentaux de la démocratie. Merci une fois de plus, Madame, pour la qualité, la clarté de votre intervention. Je crois qu'il est maintenant temps de pouvoir laisser la parole à l'auditoire et pour vos interventions, vos remarques et également vos questions. Et naturellement, le temps joue contre nous. Donc, je vais nous demander d'être assez clair, concis, précis et bref dans nos interventions et dans nos questions. Et je ne sais pas s'il y a des gens pour passer le micro dans la salle. Et nous allons donner la parole. Oui.
Avant de procéder, je vais parler en portugais pour avertir tout le monde. Aproveito desta oportunidade para agradecer pelas boas comunicações aqui feitas pelos painelistas. Eu sou Dionísio Pereira, sou do Fórum Cabo-Verdiano da Sociedade Civil e gostaria de aproveitar desta oportunidade, primeiro para felicitar os painelistas pela brilhante intervenção, as questões levantadas, e aqui seguir um pouco a pisada, quer do professor Emanuel, mas sobretudo da Naná, numa matéria que é bastante relevante em relação a todas as discussões que nós vamos tendo, e eu me permito de dizer que muitas vezes continuamos a chover sobre o que já está molhado e sem fazer nenhum efeito. É fundamental tomarmos com muita seriedade algumas sugestões aqui deixadas, algumas chamadas de atenção. Há a questão da fragilidade da governança no seio das nossas organizações da sociedade civil. Há a implicação das nossas organizações na dinâmica política partidária, que fragiliza-nos. Há fragilidade em matéria de corrida atrás de fundos, de financiamentos de terceiros, que acabam por manipular e instrumentalizar as organizações da sociedade civil em seus proveitos, incluindo os políticos e interesses estrangeiros. De modo que, a este nível, eu gostaria de apelar a que façamos da UADEMOS e das demais organizações da sociedade civil da África Ocidental parceiros da CDAO para a promoção e a implementação do protocolo da democracia e da boa governança no seio da nossa comunidade. Levar isso para as escolas, como mencionado aqui pelo professor Emanuel, fazer com que pratiquemos o exercício tanto da democracia, mas fundamentalmente fazer com que observemos a componente da governança. Nós colocamos muitos recursos na observação eleitoral e dormimos durante muito tempo entre dois processos eleitorais consecutivos. Ora, o que mais interessa é a governança, porque se houver boa governação, não há necessidade da alteração da ordem constitucional, porque a população estará de pé para a sua defesa. E obviamente que falar de observação eleitoral é estar a seguir os passos dos políticos na conquista pelo poder, quando o que interessa é a satisfação das necessidades e dos interesses das populações, e não da cor do rosto de quem é ator político em funções. Pode ser preto, branco, gordo, magro, não importa. Importa é que trabalhe para responder aos interesses e às necessidades das populações. Portanto, este é o apelo maior para que trabalhemos na observação dos processos de governança, muito mais do que em processos de observação eleitoral. Estou a ser longo, mas só para fechar, dou um exemplo do porquê da importância disto e chamo a atenção para um país, mais uma vez chamo a atenção para esse país, que é a Guiné-Bissau, que poderá ser o próximo país a sofrer golpe de Estado. Bateu-se palmas, felicitou-se aqui de que houve um processo eleitoral bom das eleições legislativas. Se analisarmos os últimos 15 anos desse país, sempre houve eleições legislativas tranquilas, mas sempre os presidentes da República decidiram alterar a ordem, a escolha do povo, porque dizem que há dificuldades de coabitação com a parte do executivo e então derruba o governo e forma-se o governo de iniciativa presidencial. O que quer dizer que todo o esforço feito e a escolha do povo para a definição e escolha do seu executivo, do seu governo, é jogado fora. E ninguém levanta a voz. E isso não é fiscalizado. E a maioria dos países, naturalmente, tem regime presidencialista. Mas o regime guineense não é presidencialista. E, portanto, é fundamental aqui que reflitamos pouco sobre estas situações e peço desculpas por ter sido bocadinho longo na minha intervenção e obrigado pela vossa atenção.
Merci.
Maintenant,
Je crois que nous allons prendre une série de 5 questions et puis donner la possibilité aux intervenants d'y répondre. Et puis, s'il y a encore le temps, on va ouvrir une série de 5 autres questions.
Square meter.
Madame. Ouais.
Merci bien. Monsieur le modérateur, les panélistes, c'était un panel de haute qualité. Les contributions sont des très grandes contributions. Je voudrais commencer par l'intervention donc du PDG d'Afrobaromètre. Et en voyant les données passées, j'ai eu comme l'impression qu'il y a une sorte de corrélation possible entre les données Afrobaromètre et la probabilité de survenir des coups d'État. Parce que quand on regarde les données, on regarde les pays où il y a eu les coups d'État et on voit les données à partir de 2014-2015 jusqu'à 2022, on voit les tendances, on peut lire entre les lignes. Moi, je me dis que Afrobaromètre peut-être doit, c'est vrai que je fais partie, mais peut-être doit aller au-delà de ce que nous avons l'habitude de faire. Félicitations d'abord au PDG, mais au réseau, pour essayer de peut-être réfléchir et voir s'il y a une possibilité de produire des données, ou en tout cas d'identifier les pays fragiles, ou beaucoup plus fragiles qui pourraient tomber dans des situations que nous connaissons. C'est une petite recommandation. La deuxième chose, je crois qu'il y a... J'ai l'impression d'être un peu confus, choqué, parce que ce qui a été dit ici, c'est la vérité. Les partis politiques, aujourd'hui, leur degré, le taux de confiance envers les partis politiques est très très faible. La société civile, madame, l'a suffisamment développée. Nous avons nos propres faiblesses. La CEDEAO, je crois que le docteur Emmanuel en a parlé. Ça veut dire que finalement, on se demande vers quelle institution il faut se tourner pour essayer de, si vous voulez, restaurer la démocratie dans la sous-région. J'aimerais bien dire que nous constituons la voie. C'est-à-dire que les organisations de la société civile constituent bel et bien la voie. Mais peut-être que ce que Wademos peut déjà faire, puisque nous parlons ici en tant que membre de Wademos, c'est de réfléchir et de voir dans quelle mesure on pourrait renforcer les capacités de nos propres organisations membres pour essayer d'éviter ce que Madame développait tout à l'heure et aussi ce que le collègue de la Guinée-Bissau a à dire par rapport à la faiblesse des organisations de la société civile d'une manière générale et faire en sorte que nous ayons un code d'éthique en notre sein pour éviter, par exemple, d'avoir certains types de comportements des organisations qui pourraient être perçues comme des organisations partisanes. L'autre recommandation que je souhaiterais faire, je ne sais pas si c'est ici, mais je pense quand même qu'en tant qu'organisation membre de Wademos, on peut voir est-ce que c'est en tant que Wademos ou en tant qu'organisation au niveau des pays, mais c'est de réfléchir et de voir comment reformuler ou aider à reformuler les chartes des partis politiques. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, les partis politiques, dans la plupart des pays, sont gérés comme des entreprises. Et donc, ce qui fait que la confiance des populations envers les partis politiques ne fait que baisser, parce que vous avez un président de parti politique, un leader de parti politique qui est à la tête du parti politique pendant 40 ans. Il n'y a pas de changement là, à ce niveau. Je pense qu'il y a peut-être un travail qu'on pourrait faire à ce niveau-là. La dernière chose, puisque je ne suis pas le seul à prendre la parole, je me dis finalement que d'après les données afro, l'institution, ou en tout cas les autorités qui sont les plus perçues comme étant crédibles, ce sont les autorités traditionnelles, les leaders traditionnels. Mais nous, en tant que Wademos, est-ce qu'on peut essayer d'établir une passerelle pour pouvoir peut-être travailler avec certaines autorités traditionnelles au niveau de nos pays et voir comment on peut peut-être arriver à une synergie d'efforts pour lutter contre ce qui se passe dans la sous-région. Je connais le cas de la Guinée, je connais d'autres pays où on peut essayer d'avoir, je ne sais pas quel type de forme de collaboration on pourrait avoir, mais c'est bon de réfléchir à voir comment on pourrait engager ces personnalités-là ou ces institutions dans ce que nous sommes en train de faire. Merci bien.
Merci, madame. Je vais vous demander à chaque fois de vous présenter avant.
D'accord, merci beaucoup. Je suis Adam Diko, je suis la directrice de AGICAD, je viens du Mali. L'une de mes préoccupations a été prise en compte par mon prédécesseur, notamment par rapport à la présentation du directeur du baromètre. Il est important souvent de signaler que ces études surviennent dans les États où il y a des coups d'État, dans un contexte où l'opinion qui est favorable au coup d'État est plus libre de parler que les opinions qui ne sont pas favorables. Donc il y a une sorte de restriction qui fait que c'est ceux qui sont en faveur des régimes militaires qui ont cette facilité ou cette protection de parler. Et que souvent ceux qui ne sont pas en faveur ou ceux qui ne soutiennent pas ont peur de parler. Donc du coup, si on se focalise sur ces données, on a l'impression que 100% de la population soutiennent, alors que non, c'est peut-être 100% des personnes interrogées et que les personnes qui ont refusé de parler, c'est souvent des personnes qui ont des opinions contraires, mais qui ont peur de l'exprimer par peur des représailles. Donc ça, c'est un premier élément. Le second élément, ça c'est par rapport au rôle de la société civile. Je pense qu'il y a un fait qui est là, qui doit nous alerter tous, c'est que les coups d'État sont souvent aussi des facteurs qui divisent davantage les acteurs de la société civile. Quand il y a des coups d'État, vous avez des acteurs de la société civile qui se positionnent en chercheurs de postes ou de pouvoir. Et ça fait que dans les pays où il y a eu les coups d'État, vous avez des sociétés civiles qui sont divisées, des sociétés civiles qui sont pour, souvent qui sont récompensées à travers des postes, et des sociétés civiles qui sont contre ou qui sont souvent méprisées, discriminées et autres. Donc, au lieu que les coups d'État ramènent les sociétés civiles à se positionner, disons, à se questionner sur leur impact, ça amène plutôt les sociétés civiles à se diviser ou à se pervertir. Le deuxième facteur par rapport à la société civile, c'est les jeunes. On a tendance à voir que les coups d'État donnent plus de possibilités aux jeunes d'accéder à des instances de prise de décision. Quand vous regardez l'âge du président de la transition au Mali ou l'âge du président de la transition au Burkina, ou les personnes qui sont membres des conseils nationaux de transition et autres, vous allez voir qu'ils sont relativement jeunes. Et que si on était parti aux élections, ces personnes auront du mal, compte tenu de leur âge, auront du mal quand même à pouvoir émerger au sein des partis politiques. Donc les coups d'État deviennent comme des facteurs qui accélèrent l'accession de ces jeunes à des postes de responsabilité, mais sauf que ce n'est pas fait dans les règles de l'art parce qu'ils ne sont pas choisis par les populations, mais ils sont plutôt imposés par les armes ou autres. Donc ça doit nous amener à nous poser la question sur les systèmes qu'on a chez nous, qui ne favorisent pas les jeunes et les femmes, et que les jeunes se voient beaucoup plutôt représentés ou écoutés dans les régimes d'exception que dans les régimes démocratiques. Merci.
Madame, oui.
Thank you very much. My name is Bernadette French from Sierra Leone, and I want to thank all the panelists for their thought-provoking insights. One of the things I want to talk about, that as we even talk about threats to democratic decline, I think we need to situate that, as many of the speakers have attested, to the broader administration of governance. And I think that is where I agree with you, Dr. Akwete, when you talked about the need for addressing politics in terms of addressing democratic deepening in the region. What we have seen over time, especially in Sierra Leone, where I come from, governance itself has been reduced to partisan politics. And we're not even talking about the generality of political parties. We're talking about the 2 or 3 main political parties that have entrenched themselves in power for decades. And so we've realized that they have used that partisan discourse to further permeate the society with ethnic disunity, with divisive politics, and that itself also has crept in to civil society, and that is destroying the state. And so that is why I agree again that civil society must strive towards thinking through more practical solutions of how we work within political parties so that we try to help them embrace and foster a culture of democratic tenets. Because at the end of the day, it is people, as much as institutional reform is okay, it is people in the institution that make those reforms. And so political party engagement is key. The next one, which would be my final point, as we speak about resisting counterfeit democracy in the present, what are we doing about activism to sustain democratic tenets in the future? And that is why the next generation conversation comes in. And I like the idea that Wadimos has included the Next Generation Initiative within the program. And I think what we need to begin to do, each one save one, and I think all of us in this room must begin to think or to identify that young man, that young woman who will work with us, who we will nurture, who we will work with to ensure that we sustain democracy. Because if we resist and address the issue of democratic decline without leaving a legacy to sustain and to maintain what we are investing in currently, then we will be back 10, 20 years to have a conversation on the same thing. Thank you very much.
Une dernière intervention et puis les intervenants pourront réagir. Oui, monsieur.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moderator, for this opportunity, and thank you, Madam Nana and Dr. Andrew Emmanuel, for your wonderful presentations. Mine is not a question, it's going to be just like the previous speakers before me. And I will start from Sierra Leone. Why should I do that? I'm doing it because I had the opportunity of being one of the LTOs during the last election. I was deployed to Bo, so I was the team leader. And I remember when we were trying to get information about the situation, one of those people that we spoke with was Marcella, although we only had her voice, so it was after her presentation that I now remember that, oh, this is one of the people that we spoke with. And as I've said, I was the team leader for the Bo region, which is one of the largest areas too. I'm part of the place where the president comes from. And having observed the election and some of the shenanigans that happened thereafter, one single thing that I took away while we were driving out of the Bo region, and when we were on that, on top of that beautiful Atlantic Ocean, crossing to Lungi Airport, was the possibility of a coup. Why did I say that? Because of the experiences that we faced when we were in Bo. Unfortunately, it's not that really that ECOWAS is handicapped. I think when we think back, especially some of us that have probably worked or served or consult for some of these organizations, including UN, AU, ECOWAS, you see that they have one thing in common: mandate. None of them could work beyond their mandate, no matter how much they try to change things. And I think that is one of the fundamental problems that we are having with the democracy or democratic institutions. And it's not something that one could just easily change. It's been there. I think if some of us with white hairs here could remember during our activism days, either in the 70s, 80s, till mid-90s, different what we are witnessing now probably is even better when we look back, thinking in terms of the Nkrumah, the Azikiwe, the Awolowos, and all of them, I mean, the Lumumba, all of them, they face the same situation that we are now still complaining about how many centuries back, I mean, decades back. So the problem has to do, in my opinion, with the sovereignty, all those sovereign countries. No matter what all these international organizations or intergovernmental organizations put in place, it cannot work if the states are not willing to cooperate, to work along with all the laid down, use the protocols, the treaties that as they were, you know, nothing will change. It will continue like this for a very long time. I'm not being negative in it, but it's truly when you just look back, have just a think of some of the things that have been happening, you see exactly what I'm saying. And for those youths that we were always thinking of, just like Dr. rightly put it, they are always thinking of being left behind. And unfortunately, unlike us, they are not willing to fight for it. Not fight in terms of the kind of anarchy, I mean, the kind of trying to be violent on it. But we were on the streets most of the time during my undergraduate life, trying to make sure that we change situation. But now the reverse is the case. They want something they are not willing to work for. And if you are not willing to work for anything, then you are not likely to be able to have a good result about it. And ideology, as Nana rightly put it, most of them are bereaved of it. Thanks so much.
Merci. Merci beaucoup. Je crois que nous allons très rapidement laisser la parole aux intervenants pour réagir, parce que bon, il n'y a pas eu de véritable question, il y a eu quelques remarques.
But rather remarks. And so I think that I'll give the floor to the panelists to complement what has been said by the different speakers. So I'll give the floor to Madam Nana first, and then to Mr. Emmanuel, and then the CEO of Afrobarometer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like you said, there were
preguntas.
To address democracy in the region. I think that we still have ECOWAS. I think we still have ECOWAS. What is good is that we now have a leadership that seems to want to engage civil society. For me, that's a huge difference. The fact that ECOWAS is now considering the setup of the ECOSOC, which is an organ of ECOWAS that has not been set up and is supposed to be the organ through which we can engage formally with ECOWAS as civil society, I think is good. And I was very happy to see that. The point also about traditional leadership, and I would add religious leadership in some of our countries. I think they are very influential. There could be some controversy around that, but I still think that that is one of the avenues that we can explore, particularly when it comes to advocating for democracy and democratic principles. So those that are progressive, I think we can engage and work with them.
Plus,
I would also say that when it comes to the divide that we see in our countries, we would have to look at, I think there's a problem with I don't know how we can address that, yeah. But we must control the narrative around democracy. I think we have a huge challenge there now. Yeah. And so, I mean, working with the media and progressive media, and looking at how we can use some of these traditional methods, like working with traditional leaders, religious leaders, who are always engaging their communities to change the narrative around democracy. And we ourselves, looking at how democracy, democracy will have to deliver for the people. Because really, we can talk about democracy all we want. If the people do not see any change in their lives, they are not going to be part of this process. And I think that's what we are seeing. I think the key tenets... Should I continue or wait till this is dealt with? Because I think it's very... okay. Are interfering with this, okay. So, a number of things. Democracy, the rule of law, and not rule by law. Transparency and accountability, checks and balances, meaningful civic participation. If even we are really pushing for these things and the citizenry are understanding this as a key part of it, I should use this one instead. Then we would be able to at least look at addressing those challenges. So I would say that that's one thing. I'm very happy about the next generation points that you made, and particularly the point you made about us, each and every one of us engaging. I think our organizations, not even us as individuals, our organizations should be looking at how do we get more young people to work with us and really imbibe the things that we are doing. There was a point that was made about the multilateral institutions and that this has always, the challenges that Nkrumah and Lumumba and others face has always been there. But there's been a lot of change. And I think civil society, the AU was not even allowing intervention of the AU into other countries where there were challenges, human rights abuses. That has changed. And that took civil society activism. So right now, the responsibility to protect is there. There's a constitutive part, there's an article in the constitutive charter of the AU that allows the AU to intervene where we have, governments unwilling or unable to protect the rights of their citizens. So that is a difference, and I think I would like to make one last point. I think ECOWAS, for example, was not set up even originally to look at the political issues and political governance issues. It's an economic, was looking at regional integration mainly for economic reasons. But again, civil society working also with an ECOWAS that was open, and I would say here, particularly under Dr. Ibn Chambers, I will continue to say this. That is where ECOWAS opened up
to engage civil society. And a lot of the frameworks that we are now seeing had civil society involvement. A number of us here were part of those processes. So we need to go back to that. ECOWAS, and Asiedu, you are here, maybe you can carry the message. And I mean, that has to happen again. We need to have civil society, ECOWAS engaging civil society strategically, technically, in looking at the different protocols, the way we are working, and how it's implemented in country. I think now our focus should not only be at the regional level, but how do we also cascade it to the national level, working with civil society, and a lot of change can happen. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et à présent, nous allons donner la parole au Dr. Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you. The lady brought this, that I should speak through this speaker, and so I'm going to do that. And I'll be brief. I think for me, okay, I should hold it. Oh, okay. Oh, it's okay, I'll hold it. Is that okay? You see, I don't know how to use this. Okay. Thank you very much for your comments and contributions and questions. I'll be pretty much brief. I like to discuss democracy in terms of generational spans, because democracy is a construction. It's not natural, but it is constructed to solve problems of a particular generation and the challenges they face, and also to make them move to the next level of development. When we stagnate, we go back. And I think that is where we are confronted with the challenge of the future of democracy. And I think it's all because if we critically examine the constitutional framework or order within which we are making this march towards democracy, consolidating democracy, there is a tension between the democratic values, liberal democratic values, and authoritarianism. In Ghana, we did not get our current constitution, which is called the Fourth Republic Constitution, 1992. And everybody thinks that that constitution came because we're all willing, we've become Democrats, and therefore we wanted the system. No, there was a tension, there was a fight, there was resistance. But international pressure and local pressure, came together to push it forward in a way that said, oh, let's see how it works for all of us. After 30 years, we are seeing this dysfunctionality in many ways. In fact, the question is, does the Constitution of Ghana today, and I hope it will apply to the other countries, is it adequately designed to promote democratic stability, democratic transformation, and for Ghana to be called one of the countries that has a strong democratic system? And everybody talks about it, including its youth. It is not. It's a fusion, it's a hybrid of authoritarianism and what the powers that be thought, if they adopted, would also accommodate those who were demanding democratic rights and freedom and transformation. They are hybrids. And that's what my review of the constitutions that came about, a few of them in 1992 or in the 90s. Because those who like authoritarian rule or believe that that's the way to go did not suddenly transform and become fully democratic. So there is always this tension and contention. But I think because we've been able to maintain the system, the stability, which was not there earlier, in the 30 years past or more, where military governments were all over one-party states and so on. We've got to work hard to consolidate the progress we've made towards democracy in its liberal sense, that our civil and political liberties are protected and can be the basis for which we think critically
about our next level of development. What institutions do we require? I do not think any of the constitutions are adequate enough as designed originally to take us where we want to go. And I think that the youth manifest that tension. Sometimes, like Afrobarometer, they tell you, yes, we like our rights and so on. We're getting schools and so on, and technology is work, but we are not getting jobs, and accountability is not there, and so on. Nobody's going to give it to us on a silver platter. But I think if Wademos looks at the tension and the fact that it is really a tension between authoritarian modes that since colonial times have prevailed, and how it's blocking us moving towards greater democracy, accountability, a generation that says they are subscribing more to that, the system will collapse. The tension is real, and we are resorting to violence. So when my colleague Nana talked about right-wing parties emerging, the Netherlands case, look at Argentina and so on. In history, these are trends that come. But I also believe strongly that the youth of today, with their exposure and all that, are not going to be the authoritarian leaders of the past and so on and so forth. Some would, but a greater majority would talk about freedom, would talk about prosperity, and so on. So for me, oh, you've given me 5 minutes. It's like 5. Do you mean 1? Oh, okay, I thought I preferred the 5. It's okay. All right. So for me, the greatest challenge we have is to think democracy in the next 30 years, because the hybrid system has to be transformed. The evidence so far is that putting the two together, aspects that says the military or parties shouldn't get involved in this and so on, what kind of parties would work for us? Because parties help us organize in our diversity and in our aspirations, our ideologies, and so on. It's a big challenge we've taken. Nobody's doing that job. Everybody's talking about reversal and stagnation, and it's a pendulum. But we have to break through and go forward. How do we do it? I believe that more of this interaction has to come from amongst us in the context we live. Sometimes the predominant literature is international on the situation facing us. And I don't think they understand it better, but all I'm saying is that the progress we've made is a compromise or a fusion between authoritarianism and democracy, particularly liberal democracy. And the parties show it, political parties and the challenges, the military that wants to come back. Look at the generation of today and the future, and let us see which direction we push further rather than stagnate or reverse. Can we go forward? Can we go forward with this model? I don't think so. So I think we must be critical. Look at political parties. In the way they functioned, is it delivering what we want? Can it give us the future where rights and social development and so on increase? Or do we critique it and say, how do we get it better? Those are the questions we should confront. Otherwise, narrating the setbacks and the challenges and leaving them there, the trend really is that if we are not careful, democracy will collapse. I don't believe it's the West that will save our democracy. I think it's our youth and ourselves. And we must think, how do we have greater of the democratic values institutionalized and imbibed as a culture by our youth? Maybe the women, inclusive governance would be stronger if our women take leadership. They take care of families better, and they might provide what we need for the next 30 years. Otherwise, I'm pretty skeptical that we can sustain the model that exists. And I don't want authoritarianism, one-party state or military. I believe parties can work, but we must create the conditions to shape them for the future. Thank you.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Dr Emmanuel. Est-ce que le docteur Joseph est en ligne? Il pourra. Si le docteur Joseph est en ligne.
run out of time. So I think I'll just continue from where Dr. Emmanuel Akweta has ended in terms of political parties. Of course, I didn't present some of the data here. Yes, I didn't present some of the data here about young people and political parties, but I think the point that has been made about political parties is very critical to the agenda of Wademos. For us, I mean, the data we are seeing so far has been that young people are less likely to identify with political parties, and over time, we've seen this being the case in several countries across West Africa, but also across the continent as well. And so just thinking about the way political parties operate and how young people are an integral part of political party activity is quite concerning, because if young people are less likely or more and more dissociating themselves from political parties, I do think that there are serious concerns that if we are looking at the generational shift in terms of how democracy would evolve over this period of time. But in line with that, I know there was a first comment about Afrobarometer data and the warning signals that is included or is contained in the data that we have. That is certainly true. And we are not just stopping there and presenting the data, but we're working with regional institutions, the African Union in particular, looking at the Peace and Security Council and figuring out ways that we can integrate Afrobarometer data into their early warning system that will allow them to begin to see signals when they begin to emerge so that they can intervene sooner than later. And so Afrobarometer does have that engagement with the African Union going forward, that our data would be embedded in the early warning systems within the African Union. We continue to engage with the regional economic bodies, including ECOWAS and the others, that we would figure out best ways that Afrobarometer data can be integrated as part of both the protocol, but as well as in the monitoring aspects of, especially when it comes to the economic issues and what they call human development across the regions. And so we do have data that can feed into these processes, and we are working with them to make sure that our data become an integral part of what they do. And the last point I want to make is, somebody mentioned about support for coup d'etats. It's not necessarily that there's general support for coup d'etats. As you can see, the data does show that generally across West Africa and the African continent, citizens do not want military rule. In general, majority of citizens reject military rule. It's just that if elected leaders abuse power, this is where we see a slim majority. It's actually not an overwhelming majority. We have about 53% of Africans saying if their elected leaders abuse power, they would be willing to countenance military intervention. And so it is not 100% of people speaking. 43% are still against it, even if elected leaders abuse power. But we do have 53% portion of young people feeling that the military should come in. That's about 56% of young people. And so I just wanted to bring this on board, but my particular take for this conversation and from this panel is about political parties. I do think that figuring out ways that we can engage with political parties to operationalize democracy within the political parties themselves, internal democracy, because we can't have non-democratic political parties that then come to rule countries trying to rule a country with democratic principles, because what you operate internally is what should be reflected nationally. And if we cannot have those processes with internal political parties, the internal operations of political parties, it can really be difficult to then translate that, because what happens internally may be what would be reflected in the national politics. And I think Emmanuel was right, because those hybrid regimes will continue to be the case if we do not work towards a system where political parties are truly, truly democratic internally before they come to rule our countries. So I'll stop here and yield to you, Mr. Moderator.
Je me demande de prendre juste une dernière question. Une dernière, c'est-à-dire d'une minute, ou une dernière intervention d'une minute. Et puis ce sera la fin. Et je vais donner la parole à Madame. Et
Oui, oui. Soyez vraiment bref, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Thank you. I would just like to share that my name is Blanche Sonor, and I would like to share on democratic decline that we are observing, experiencing in our sub-region. And this brings about the question of accountability. We are not impacting the government, we are not questioning them because they do not feel accountable to their people. And this is where there is a need to rethink the notion of public service in the general interest and not only the personal interests of our political leaders. The data of Afrobarometer shows that we are not commending coup d'etat. It's just that the population is seeing coup d'etat as an alternative to the that we are experiencing today. And so we need to impact governments and we need to hold them responsible so that we can have strong institutions and not strong men. The second element is that we'll need to re-establish trust, ensure a rebirth of trust in the institutions that we have. The youth that are commending coup d'etat are seeing that there is despair and the hopes they have in political leaders are becoming vain. And so the youth either align themselves with the political parties just as a way of being able to make it in life, or they
les dirigeants restent sourds à ces cris stridents, d'où la nécessité pour nous
cry out to government to behave in a way that will serve their interests. And so this is where we must come in and advocate to governments in real time so that we are able to limit the prevalence of coup d'etat in the region. We have political leaders who are acting in their own interests and not in the interest of the population. And this is why coup d'etat is on the rise in the region. And so we need to come back to the problem of accountability. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Oui. Ça va être vraiment le tout dernier.
This will really be the last speaker. Please.
The two-day conference, or they were leaving, and they said, well, they are leaving because they have other things to think about and also report on. And then I said, well, do we even care about what is happening in the region? Do we have mainstream journalists and media caring about what is happening and all this talk we are having about democratic recession, democratic decline, and all of that? And it was the major focus for the West Africa Media Excellence Conference and Award that we had, I think, about 2 weeks ago, that indeed there is a lot of narrative running around, a lot of narratives around a liberal democracy, narratives around pro-coup conversations, sometimes even on social media. And we are asking, so where is the media in all of this? We are talking about a West Africa where currently we don't have any regional frameworks when it comes to issues of access to information, freedom of expression, and media development. We also have a media that are now more concerned about their own survival and sustainability and viability issues more than exactly what is happening in the region, because then as framers of public discourse, as agenda setters, we don't seem to have the media focused on the issues that we are all talking about. And they're also supposed to be part of civil society. In the conversations at the Media and Democracy Conference at Wameka this year, I think one of the key things that came up was how we can get the media to also be at the front line when it comes to the fight around reversing democratic retrogression in West Africa. And one of the key things or suggestions that came up was how we can build strong alliances of media institutions. I'm really talking about mainstream media, strong alliances, because as we speak, we used to have the West Africa Journalists Association. It is no longer in existence. And then beyond that, we have just national level associations who are just trying their own things. So I think the point Nana made about the phones, we know what is happening in the Sahel region, but how many media organizations in Ghana even care about what is happening in the Sahel? Because it's happening in the Sahel. It really doesn't concern them. It's really not trickled down to the South for us to really feel what is going on. So I just thought that I should put across this point, this strong point about how we can also get the media to build that kind of regional alliance, to be able to have a strong voice when it comes to these issues, so that when things are happening in other countries, we would have the media in other countries also reporting on these. Currently in Burkina Faso, it's so difficult for journalists to report on what is happening. So if journalists outside of Burkina Faso can take up these issues, then it makes our voices stronger than what we are experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup à toutes et à tous pour la...
Thank you all for your contributions. I think that it is time to conclude this panel on 3 points. I think it is important to draw the attention of Wademos on to some threats that are congenital with regards to coup d'etat. I think there's syndicalization of pushers, and they are promoting the ideology of coup d'etat, and their military regimes are learning from the experiences of other countries to be able to be successful in their coup d'etat, and then the pushers are have the impression that the people owe them something, and so that is why they do not want to end the transitions. And then the last element is the fact that today in most of the countries where our institutions are involved in transition regimes, the people have stopped thinking. And so there's no longer space for reflections. And where there's no reflection, it's hard for this country to develop. And so we would conclude on these points. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody, all the speakers, for the quality of their contributions, and then again say that the fight continues. The issue of standards and institution ECOWAS have been. We also need to think about strong institutions, and again, virtuous men who will lead our states. Is it not time for people, CSOs, to commit themselves to ensure that the right policies are made? Thank you once again for the quality of your contributions. Thank you.
Very, very useful and substantive discussion here. We're very grateful to our moderator. The moderator has really done great. Let's clap for the moderator of the event. And also to our panelists, fantastic, terrific job. We all enjoyed the conversations. And of course, to the participants for the various contributions, comments, and questions that came through. So I'm glad that we've had this first part really taken care of in a very major way. And to our guest who was also online, we are grateful. So this has got off to a very flying start, but as I'm sure all of us feel, it's just about time to go across the room and try to refuel